12 people do not simply vanish. That is the thought that has stayed with everyone who has ever looked at this case. Law enforcement officers who worked it in the late 1980s and carried it with them into retirement. Journalists who covered the initial search and then covered the silence that followed for 3.5 decades. Families who drove to western North Carolina every summer for years afterward and stood at the edge of Nantahala Forest and tried to understand how 12 people, a complete overnight camp group with 2 counselors and 10 teenagers, could walk into 700,000 acres of hardwood and rhododendron on a Friday afternoon in August and leave behind nothing, not a boot print, not a scrap of gear, not a name carved in bark that told anyone where they had gone. 12 people do not simply vanish. And yet for 34 years, that is exactly what David Ashworth's Lakewood Wilderness Camp Group 7 had done. The group had checked out of the base camp near Bryson City at 1:15 p.m. on August 12, 1988, bound for a 3-night loop in the Nantahala backcountry that their route card said would bring them back to the trailhead by Monday evening. The route card came back. The people did not. It would take 34 years, the death of a man named Clifton Ware, the contents of a sealed 10-by-10 storage unit in Asheville that his estate attorney opened on a Tuesday morning in October 2022, and a retired detective who had been waiting for exactly this kind of Tuesday his entire career to explain what happened on that trail between Friday afternoon and Monday evening in August of 1988. But to understand what was in that storage unit and what it cost 12 families to live through the 34 years before it opened, you have to go back to the summer of 1988. You have to go back to Bryson City and the Nantahala and the particular world that 12 young people and 2 counselors walked out of on a Friday afternoon when the August heat was finally breaking and the mountains were doing what they do in late summer in western North Carolina, pulling the afternoon clouds down onto their shoulders like they owned the sky. Bryson City in 1988 sat at the foot of the Great Smoky Mountains in Swain County, a small town of roughly 1,300 people defined almost entirely by its relationship with the land around it. The Tuckasegee River running through the center of town, the Nantahala Gorge to the south, the Smokies to the north, the Deep Creek trails threading through hardwood forest in every direction. It was a town that existed partly because of the mountains and partly in spite of them. And the people who lived there year-round carried that relationship in their posture, a steady, quiet competence about outdoor life that made them skeptical of anyone who treated the backcountry as merely scenic. Lakewood Wilderness Camp had operated in Swain County since 1971. It was not a luxury operation. Canvas platform tents, communal cook stoves, Appalachian Trail sections for the older groups. The camp drew teenagers from middle-class families across the Southeast. The kind of families who believed in summer programs that involved physical challenge and minimal electronics. In 1988, electronics were minimal everywhere, so the distinction carried less weight than it would today. The campers brought station wagon coolers and handwritten letters from home and VHS tapes of their favorite movies that they could not watch until they returned to base camp on Sunday evenings. Group 7 in the summer of 1988 consisted of 10 campers between the ages of 14 and 17 and 2 counselors, David Ashworth, 24, a geology graduate student from Appalachian State who had been a Lakewood counselor for 3 summers and was known in the camp community as careful, experienced, and temperamentally suited to the backcountry in a way not every counselor was. And Patricia Patty Ross, 22, completing her undergraduate degree in environmental science at Western Carolina on her first summer as a full counselor after 2 years as a junior counselor. The 10 campers came from Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Virginia. They were 14 to 17 years old. They had names and families and school lives and the particular combination of adolescent awkwardness and emerging competence that belongs to that age. Some of them were on their second or third Lakewood summer, old hands, comfortable with the weight of a pack and the protocol of a backcountry camp. Some were newer, there on a parent's recommendation or a friend's enthusiasm, finding their footing. David Ashworth had filed his route card the morning of August 12th. The planned loop ran south from the Apple Tree Group Camp trailhead into the Nantahala backcountry, following Laurel Branch to a first-night campsite at Big Laurel, then west to a second site near Junie Wank, then a third night at Standing Indian before the return loop to the trailhead by Monday evening. Ashworth had run a variation of this loop twice before. He knew the terrain. He had checked weather. He had checked water sources. He had signed every form the camp required. At 1:15 p.m., Group 7 shouldered their packs at the base camp parking lot, called out goodbyes to the staff they were leaving behind, and walked toward the trailhead in a column of 12. Nobody at the base camp ever saw them again. The first indication that something was wrong came at 7:45 p.m. on Monday, August 15th, when Group 7 had not returned to the trailhead by their logged expected arrival of 5 p.m. The base camp director, a man named Roger Stills, waited 2 hours before calling it, because groups ran late all the time, a twisted ankle, an afternoon thunderstorm, a slower pace than planned. At 7:45, he called the Swain County Sheriff's Office. By 9:00 p.m. that Monday, 2 deputies were at the Apple Tree trailhead with flashlights. By 6 a.m. Tuesday, the Nantahala National Forest Service had activated a search. By Wednesday, the search had drawn in Cherokee County Search and Rescue, volunteer teams from 3 adjacent counties, and a coordinating team from the North Carolina Emergency Management Division. Helicopters ran grid searches over the canopy. Ground teams swept each segment of the planned route. Big Laurel campsite, no sign of occupation. No fire ring disturbance. No tent stakes. Junie Wank, nothing. Standing Indian, nothing. The trail between Trailhead and Big Laurel, a 3.5-hour walk under normal conditions, showed no sign that 12 people and 12 full backpacks had passed through it. No boot prints in the soft soil near the creek crossings. No broken vegetation at the side trail junction. No litter, which itself was significant. 12 teenagers over 3 days produce at least some quantity of inadvertent litter, no matter how scrupulous the counselors are. The search ran for 11 days. It covered 46 trail miles and 12,000 acres of intensive ground search. Aircraft flew 87 sorties. Not one item belonging to any member of Group 7, not a tent pole, not a bandana, not a single boot print, was recovered inside the search perimeter. The route card was the only thing that came back. It had been filed in the base camp's outgoing box by Ashworth himself on Friday morning. It was the last document any member of Group 7 touched. On the third day of the search, a detail was noted in the base camp log and then set aside without adequate follow-up. A detail that 34 years later would be central to everything. A vehicle had been signed in at the camp's vehicle access gate on Friday morning at 11 a.m. Approximately 2 hours before Group 7's departure. It had been logged as a supply delivery from a local outfitter. The outfitter, contacted the following week, had no record of a delivery to Lakewood Wilderness Camp on August 12, 1988. The vehicle's license plate had been recorded in the gate log. It was logged. It was noted. And in the organized chaos of an 11-day search for 12 missing people, it was not followed up with the urgency the discrepancy warranted. The lead investigator assigned to the Group 7 case in the fall of 1988, after the search was formally suspended, was Detective James Jim Sutherland of the Swain County Sheriff's Office. a 16-year veteran, methodical and tenacious, who had worked every serious case in Swain County since 1972, and who would later say that the Group 7 case was the one that never fully let him go. Not in 35 years of occasional return visits to the file, not in retirement, not ever. Sutherland pursued the vehicle registration from the gate log in October 1988. The plate came back to a leasing company in Asheville. The leasing company's records for that period were incomplete. A fire in their storage facility in 1991 had destroyed several years of contract documents. The lessee of the vehicle could not be conclusively identified. A man named Clifton Ware appeared in the investigative record for the first time in November 1988. He was 36 years old, an Asheville-based private wilderness guide who had led corporate and private group expeditions throughout western North Carolina since the early 1980s. His name surfaced because a former Lakewood Wilderness Camp staff member mentioned him in an interview as someone who had expressed interest in acquiring the camp's client lists the previous year, an overture that camp director Roger Stills had declined. Ware was interviewed by Sutherland in December 1988. He was cooperative, articulate, and had a documented alibi for August 12th. A guided fishing excursion in Transylvania County for a group of 4 clients, confirmed by all 4 in subsequent interviews. He was eliminated. Sutherland knew, in the way experienced investigators know things they cannot yet prove, that the elimination was too clean. The alibi was solid, but the solidity of it bothered him rather than reassuring him. He wrote in his case notes, "Ware remains a person of interest in my view. The alibi is confirmed. The interest in the client list is not explained." He filed those notes and returned to them twice in the following years. Meanwhile, 12 families were doing what families do when the official investigation yields nothing and the search teams have gone home. They drove to Bryson City. They walked the trails. They put up flyers in outfitter shops and ranger stations. They called Sutherland. They called the camp. They called each other. Because the grief of 12 families in the same incomprehensible situation creates a bond that nobody would have chosen and nobody could escape. One of the families, the Ashworths, David's parents from Boone, North Carolina, made a different choice. Harold Ashworth, a retired high school principal who had spent 20 years teaching young people how to think through difficult problems, began compiling his own case file in the months after the search ended. He collected every document the family could obtain through public records. He wrote letters to the National Park Service, the Forest Service, the State Bureau of Investigation, and eventually to his congressman. He organized the 12 families into a group that communicated regularly and shared information when any of them found it. Harold Ashworth spent 22 years compiling that file before his health declined enough to prevent him from continuing. He died in 2011. His wife, Miriam, kept the file in a cabinet by the front door of their house in Boone. By 2000, 12 years had passed since Group 7 walked away from the base camp parking lot. The Lakewood Wilderness Camp had closed in 1993. It had never fully recovered from the reputational and liability consequences of the 1988 disappearance, and Roger Stills retired without reopening it. The cabins and platform tents deteriorated quietly, back into the Swain County landscape. Jim Sutherland had been promoted to chief deputy by 1995 and no longer worked active cases, but he reviewed the Group 7 file every summer in August because he felt it was owed. He reached out to each of the 12 families individually every year on the anniversary of the disappearance. A handwritten note. A brief phone call for those who wanted it. 12 families, 12 notes, 12 calls, every August for 33 years. By 2010, the trail junction signs near the Apple Tree Trailhead had been replaced twice since 1988. The campsite at Big Laurel had been used by hundreds of groups in the intervening years, its ground memory of 1988, long overwritten by subsequent occupants. The Nantahala held its secrets with the equanimity of old mountains, which is to say, absolutely. Clifton Ware had continued his wilderness guide operation through the 1990s and into the 2000s, building a respectable regional reputation. He led corporate retreats, school groups, private expeditions. He purchased a small property outside Asheville in 1997. He never married. He had no children. He donated to a trail maintenance fund in the Nantahala every year, which struck people who knew him later as the kind of thing that would strike people differently after they knew what they came to know. He was diagnosed with a terminal illness in 2019 and spent the final years of his life in diminishing capacity at a care facility near Asheville. He died on August 7, 2022. 5 days before the 34th anniversary of the day Group 7 walked away from the parking lot. He left no relatives. His estate consisted of the Asheville property, a modest savings account, and the contents of a storage unit on Swannanoa River Road in Asheville that his estate attorney, a woman named Carol Beal, had been notified of, but had not yet accessed. Every case on this channel is built from careful research and respect for the people at the center of each story. If this case is holding you the way it has held so many people for so long, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. This community spans every corner of the world. Now let's go back to what Carol Beal found when she opened that unit. On October 4, 2022, Carol Beal unlocked the storage unit on Swannanoa River Road with the key found in Clifton Ware's personal effects. The unit was 10 by 10 feet. It was clean. It was organized. It had been maintained. The rental payments had been made automatically from an account set up in 1989, which meant the unit had been continuously rented, continuously paid, continuously sealed for 33 years. Inside were 12 backpacks. 12, still packed, still cinched, still tagged with the name labels that camp policy required on all gear. 12 sleeping bags rolled and strapped. 12 mess kits. And in a fireproof document box in the far right corner of the unit, organized in labeled manila folders. A set of documents that Carol Beal could not fully comprehend, but understood enough of to know that she needed to stop reading and call the police. She called the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office at 2:17 p.m. The document box contained, among other items, a handwritten operational ledger covering the period August through September 1988, detailing transport logistics, communications protocols, and financial transactions totaling several $100,000, a set of photographs, and a folded paper route map of the Nantahala backcountry. With a route marked in red that diverged from the route card David Ashworth had filed at Lakewood's base camp, diverged from it within the first mile of the trailhead, turning not south toward Big Laurel, but west toward a Forest Service road that was accessible, on the August 1988 map, by a vehicle with 4-wheel drive. Jim Sutherland received a call from the Buncombe County Sheriff at 4:30 p.m. On October 4, 2022, he was 71 years old, retired for 6 years, living outside Bryson City in a house with a view of the Tuckasegee River. He listened to the summary of what had been found. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "The vehicle. The one at the gate on August 12th. The investigator on the other end said, "It's in the ledger." The documents in Clifton Ware's storage unit, examined over the following weeks by a joint investigative team from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. The Swain County Sheriff's Office and the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office told a story that had been financially motivated, methodically planned, and protected by 3.5 decades of a dead man's silence. Ware had not operated alone. The ledger documented a network, a term the SPI used carefully and precisely in their subsequent reporting. of individuals who had been involved in what the legal filings eventually described as a kidnapping and human trafficking enterprise targeting isolated wilderness groups. The fishing excursion alibi in Transylvania County on August 12, 1988, had been genuine. Ware had been there, with 4 clients, all afternoon. What the alibi had never been asked to account for was what happened before the fishing excursion began, in the 2 hours between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. On August 12th, when a vehicle he had arranged logged into the Lakewood camp gate, and what happened after, the logistics, the transport, the financial trail, none of which required Ware's physical presence at the trailhead. The 4 clients who confirmed the alibi in 1988 were interviewed again in November 2022. 2 had died. 1 did not recall the specific date with clarity. 1, a man now in his 70s, living in Forsyth County, confirmed the excursion and told investigators that Ware had been, in his recollection, unusually distracted that day. He had taken several phone calls. He had seemed to be waiting for something. The photographs in the document box, authenticated by the spy's forensic imaging unit, placed the 12 members of Group 7 at a location outside the Nantahala perimeter that had never been searched. A rural property in Graham County, approximately 22 miles from the Apple Tree Trailhead, on a road that did not appear on standard hiking maps of the area. The financial ledger documented payments, dates, amounts, routing information through accounts that the spy's financial crimes unit traced across multiple jurisdictions. It was the most comprehensive self-documenting criminal record investigators in the spy's cold case unit said they had encountered. Ware had kept everything. For 33 years, in a sealed and paid unit on Swannanoa River Road, he had kept everything. Why he kept it, whether from pride or guilt or some combination of the two that most people are not built to understand, was a question that went unanswered with his death. The spy investigation expanded through 2023, with arrests made in 3 states by April of that year. The case remains partially active as of the time of this video's publication. The full accounting of what happened to the 12 members of Group 7 in August of 1988 is a story that is still being told in courtrooms and legal proceedings, and in deference to those proceedings and to the families involved, this video will not present conclusions that the legal process has not yet fully reached. What can be said, the families know. After 34 years, the families know more than they did. The silence broke. The unit opened. And Jim Sutherland's note about the vehicle in the gate log, written in December 1988, filed, never followed up, was confirmed as the thread that, pulled correctly, would have unraveled everything 30 years earlier. 12 people walked into the Nantahala on a Friday afternoon in August 1988. They were 14 to 24 years old. They had packed for 3 nights and a Monday return. They had called out goodbyes from a parking lot. They were going to come back. David Ashworth had run this loop twice before. He knew the terrain. He had checked the weather and the water sources and signed every form. He was 24 years old and he was good at his job, and he had no reason, and his group had no reason, to expect anything other than the trail. Harold Ashworth died in 2011 with his file in a cabinet by the front door. Miriam Ashworth, his widow, was called by the Swain County Sheriff's Office on October 5, 2022, the day after the storage unit was opened. She was 81 years old. She was told that new evidence had been recovered that was directly relevant to the disappearance of her son's group. She was told that the case was being actively investigated. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harold always said there was a vehicle. He had. It was in the file." Jim Sutherland drove to Boone the following week and sat at Miriam Ashworth's kitchen table for 3 hours. He brought his own notes from 1988. She brought Harold's file. They went through it together, page by page, the way two people go through something that should have been resolved 34 years earlier, and wasn't, which requires a particular kind of grace that most of us are only capable of when there is finally, at last, something real to do with our hands. 3 questions will stay with this case long after the legal proceedings conclude. What does it mean for 12 families that the evidence was kept, that Clifton Ware chose to preserve rather than destroy, and that the preservation ultimately delivered justice, however late? What obligation did the investigators of 1988 fail to fulfill when the vehicle's license plate was logged and not followed? And how many other cold cases have a note in a file somewhere that nobody pulled hard enough? And what do you think Harold Ashworth, who spent 22 years compiling a file that helped crack this case open, would have said if he had lived to see that storage unit door swing open? Leave your answers below. 34 years of silence broke in October 2022, and the questions it leaves behind deserve exactly the kind of conversation this community knows how to have. Justice is still arriving for the 12 members of Group 7 and the families who never stopped waiting. Stories like theirs exist because some people kept records and some people kept faith. And eventually those two things found each other across 34 years of silence. If you believe that truth, however buried, is worth pursuing, subscribe. More cases are in the description below. Thank you for watching.